Quantum manifestation rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with excitement, clarity, or obvious signs. In fact, the moment it truly begins is often the moment people assume nothing is happening. Life looks the same on the surface. Routines continue. Conversations sound familiar. Yet, internally, something feels subtly out of place. Not wrong, just different. A quiet detachment from the urgency that once drove you. A strange calm where expectation used to live. This is where most people misinterpret the shift and unknowingly step away from it. They've been conditioned to believe that change should be loud, that manifestation should feel energizing and motivating. So when silence appears instead, the mind labels it as stagnation. But silence is not absence. Silence is reorganization. And if you're in this phase right now, you're not stuck. You're exactly where the quantum shift begins.
Quantum manifestation rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with excitement, clarity, or obvious signs. In fact, the moment it truly begins is often the moment people assume nothing is happening. Life looks the same on the surface. Routines continue. Conversations sound familiar. Yet internally, something feels subtly out of place. Not wrong, just different. A quiet detachment from the urgency that once drove you. A strange calm where expectation used to live. This is where most people misinterpret the shift and unknowingly step away from it. We've been conditioned to believe that change should be loud, that manifestation should feel energizing, emotional, motivating. So when silence appears instead, the mind labels it as stagnation. But silence is not absence. Silence is reorganization. It's what happens when the old internal structure stops broadcasting clearly, and the new one hasn't fully stabilized yet. Nothing has failed. The signal is simply recalibrating. At this stage, the most noticeable change isn't in circumstances. It's in perception. You may notice that things you once cared deeply about no longer pull you the same way. Goals that used to feel urgent lose their emotional charge. Conversations feel repetitive. Noise feels heavier. And instead of craving more stimulation, you feel drawn towards simplicity, distance, or stillness. This can be confusing if you don't understand what's happening because it doesn't feel like progress in the way you were taught to recognize it. From the outside, it looks like nothing. From the inside, it feels like a pause you didn't consciously choose. And that's exactly why this phase is so often missed. The mind wants movement it can measure, but the quantum field doesn't respond to visible effort. It responds to internal coherence. And coherence always forms before motion. Scientifically, this is what happens when the nervous system begins shifting out of survival-based patterning. When your baseline emotional state changes, the brain updates its predictions. Old outcomes lose relevance. Familiar futures stop feeling inevitable. But because this update happens internally, without immediate feedback from the environment, the mind struggles to categorize it. There's no label for something important is happening quietly. Spiritually, this phase has been described for centuries as the void, the gap, the in-between, not a place of loss, but of suspension. The old identity is loosening its grip, yet the new one hasn't fully emerged. The field is no longer receiving the old signal, but the new frequency is still stabilizing. That space feels empty only if you expect it to be filled immediately. This is where impatience becomes dangerous. When people don't recognize this quiet phase, they try to force momentum. They reintroduce urgency. They look for signs. They push themselves to feel motivated again. And in doing so, they often reactivate the very signal that was dissolving. Not because they failed, but because they mistook silence for a problem. If you're in this phase, you may feel less reactive than before, but also less driven, less anxious, but also less excited. This emotional neutrality isn't apathy. It's disengagement from outdated internal narratives. The system is conserving energy, while it reorganizes. And reorganization always happens before expression. The paradox is that this quiet phase is often the most fragile and the most powerful moment in the entire process. Fragile because it's easy to abandon it out of misunderstanding. Powerful because once the old signal fully dissolves, the field has no choice but to respond to what replaces it. Most people never allow this phase to complete. They rush past it. They distract themselves. They fill the silence with noise. And later they wonder why manifestation feels inconsistent or delayed. But the delay wasn't in the field. It was in their willingness to remain present while the internal shift was forming. In the comments, drop one word that describes the quiet phase you're in right now. Maybe it's recalibrating. Maybe it's neutral. Maybe it's suspended. Maybe it's something uniquely yours. Let that word be a small but profound declaration, a signal you send not just in this space, but into the quantum field itself. If you're watching this and recognizing yourself, there's nothing you need to fix. There's nothing you need to do yet. What's happening is not a lack of movement, it's preparation. The quiet you're experiencing isn't a pause imposed on you. It's the first indication that the old timeline is no longer being reinforced. And once that reinforcement stops, the next phase becomes inevitable. Because when the internal structure changes, reality always follows, just not on the timeline the mind expects. Reality never moves randomly. This is why quantum manifestation feels confusing to those who expect immediate feedback. The field doesn't respond to urgency or effort. It responds to internal order. And order is established inwardly before it can express itself outwardly. When your internal state begins to change, your perception updates first. You start interpreting the same situations differently. The same environment stops evoking the same emotional responses. This isn't imagination. It's the brain recalibrating its predictive models. Neuroscience shows that perception is not passive, it's constructed. When your baseline state shifts, the brain stops anticipating the same outcomes, even if the external inputs haven't changed yet. This internal update creates a delay that many people misunderstand. They expect reality to reflect their shift immediately, but the system doesn't work that way. The quantum field responds to stable signals, not transient ones. It waits for coherence to settle. During this period, nothing dramatic happens because nothing needs to happen yet. The internal signal is still becoming consistent. Spiritually, this phase has always been described as alignment without confirmation. You're no longer operating from the old identity, but the world hasn't adjusted to the new one yet. This gap can feel disorienting if you don't understand it. The mind looks outward for reassurance, but reassurance hasn't been generated yet. Not because it won't come, but because the signal isn't fully locked in. What's critical to understand is that this internal first process is not optional, it's structural. Reality cannot reorganize around a signal that isn't stable. If the internal state fluctuates, the external environment remains fluid. That's why forcing change during this phase often backfires. The system interprets force as instability and delays response. You may notice that your relationship with time begins to change here. The future feels closer, less abstract. The past feels less emotionally relevant. This isn't a sign that you're impatient or disconnected. It's a sign that your reference point is shifting. The mind is no longer anchored where it used to be, but it hasn't fully anchored to what's next yet. This is also where people start questioning themselves. They wonder if they're imagining things, if they're over-interpreting subtle sensations. But subtlety is the point. Loud shifts are rarely stable. Quiet ones are. The deeper the internal change, the less it needs to announce itself. From the field's perspective, what matters is not what you say you want, but what your internal system expects. Expectation is embodied. It lives in posture, tone, breath, reaction speed. When those elements change, the signal changes. Reality doesn't need instructions beyond that. This is why manifestation always begins before you notice it. By the time external events start aligning, the internal shift is already complete. The field simply catches up to a state that has stopped fluctuating. If you're in this phase, patience is not waiting. It's allowing the signal to stabilize without interference. The worst thing you can do is treat silence as failure. Silence is feedback. It means the system is recalibrating rather than resisting. And once that recalibration settles, the next phase becomes visible. Not as noise, but as subtle confirmation that something irreversible has already started. If this resonates with you, hit subscribe and click the bell icon next to it. Also, join our Manifestation Club on gogetter.au. This isn't just a channel, this is a frequency. If you felt something shift while watching, you're already tuned in. We're not just consuming content here. We're honoring the quiet phases of quantum transformation. Let's keep evolving together. One of the biggest misunderstandings about quantum manifestation is believing that the shift begins when something external finally changes. In reality, by the time life rearranges itself visibly, the most important part has already happened. The signs don't appear as miracles, they appear as subtle internal contradictions, moments where the old way of being simply doesn't fit anymore. You may notice that your reactions have slowed down, not because you're trying to be calm, but because certain situations no longer register as urgent. Things that once triggered overthinking, emotional spikes, or the need to control outcomes now pass through you with less friction. This isn't numbness. It's the nervous system releasing patterns it no longer needs to protect. Another sign is the quiet loss of interest in explaining yourself. You feel less compelled to justify decisions, defend choices, or narrate your process to others. It's not secrecy. It's internal alignment. When identity stabilizes, the need for external validation drops naturally. You're no longer asking permission from the environment to become who you're becoming. You might also notice a strange simplification in decision-making. Choices that used to feel heavy suddenly feel obvious. Not easy, obvious. The mental back and forth dissolves. You don't need to convince yourself. You don't need to weigh every possible outcome. The body already knows which direction is coherent, even if the mind can't fully articulate why yet. Another common signal is a reduced attachment to old desires. Goals you once chased with intensity may now feel distant or irrelevant. Not because you failed to achieve them, but because they belong to a different version of you. This can feel confusing if you've been taught that ambition should always increase, but ambition tied to an outdated identity naturally dissolves when the internal structure shifts. There's also often a growing sensitivity to noise, not just literal sound, but emotional noise, social drama, constant stimulation. You may find yourself craving quieter environments, fewer conversations, less input. This isn't withdrawal, it's integration. The system instinctively reduces interference, while coherence stabilizes. From a scientific perspective, these changes reflect a reduction in cognitive load, fewer internal conflicts, fewer competing narratives. The brain conserves energy by letting go of predictions that no longer serve a purpose. Spiritually, this is what alignment feels like before it has a name. Less effort, less resistance, less internal negotiation. What makes these signs easy to dismiss is their ordinariness. There's nothing flashy about them, no announcement, no external marker to point to. And because they don't match the dramatic version of transformation people expect, they often get ignored or overridden. But these are the exact indicators that a quantum shift is underway. The danger isn't missing these signs, it's misunderstanding them. When people interpret neutrality as stagnation, they try to recreate intensity. They seek motivation. They force excitement. And in doing so, they reintroduce the very patterns that were dissolving. Not intentionally, but reflexively. If you recognize these signs, it means the shift has already begun, not hypothetically, not someday, now. The field is responding to a signal that's no longer fluctuating the way it used to. Reality hasn't moved yet because it doesn't need to rush. The internal structure is still settling. What matters next is how you respond to this phase, whether you allow the quiet to complete its work or interrupt it by trying to feel something familiar again. Because the way you handle this moment determines whether the shift deepens or collapses back into the old pattern. In the comments, share one sign you've been noticing that confirms your internal shift. Maybe it's emotional neutrality. Maybe it's simplified decisions. Maybe it's reduced attachment. Maybe it's something uniquely yours. Your awareness matters. Your recognition matters. Because you matter. This is the moment where many quantum shifts quietly collapse. Not because something went wrong, but because the mind mistakes silence for a problem that needs to be solved. When external reality hasn't moved yet, the urge to do something becomes almost irresistible. Action feels like safety. Movement feels like control. But in this phase, premature action doesn't accelerate manifestation. It fragments the signal. Forcing action usually doesn't come from alignment. It comes from discomfort with uncertainty. The ego wants proof. It wants feedback. It wants reassurance that the shift is real. So it reaches for familiar strategies, planning harder, visualizing more intensely, talking about it, trying to lock it in. But all of these behaviors reintroduce urgency, and urgency destabilizes coherence. From a neurological perspective, this makes sense. The brain is wired to resolve ambiguity as quickly as possible. When it can't predict outcomes, it defaults to control behaviors. It prefers a familiar struggle over an unfamiliar calm. That's why forcing action often feels logical in the moment, even when it quietly reverses progress. Spiritually, this is the moment where trust replaces effort. Not blind trust, embodied trust. Trust that the internal shift doesn't need immediate expression to be valid. Trust that coherence is doing work you can't yet see. When you interrupt this phase with unnecessary action, you're not speeding up the process. You're telling the field that the signal isn't stable enough to wait. This is also why many people say, "I almost had it and then everything fell apart." In reality, nothing fell apart. They simply reactivated the old pattern because it felt more familiar than staying present in the unknown. The old identity knows how to chase. It knows how to strive. It doesn't know how to wait without tension. Another subtle way people force action is through over-communication, explaining the shift to others, seeking validation, asking for opinions. Each explanation pulls the experience back into language before it's fully integrated. Language is powerful, but it can also solidify things too early. Some phases need to remain unspoken to stabilize. This doesn't mean you do nothing. It means you move differently. Actions in this phase are quiet, precise, and often invisible. You respond instead of initiating. You simplify instead of expanding. You remove friction instead of adding effort. These choices protect coherence rather than test it. One of the clearest indicators that you're forcing is emotional urgency. If the action carries tension, fear of missing out, or a need for immediate results, it's likely coming from the old signal. Aligned action feels calm, even when it's decisive. It doesn't argue with itself. It doesn't need justification. This is also where comparison becomes dangerous. Watching others move faster, announce changes, or celebrate visible results can trigger impatience. But comparison pulls your attention outward, away from your own internal rhythm. Quantum shifts are not synchronized events. They unfold according to internal readiness, not external timelines. If you're in this phase, the most powerful thing you can do is protect the quiet. Let the nervous system finish recalibrating. Let the new identity settle without asking it to perform yet. Every time you resist the urge to force momentum, you strengthen the signal the field is already responding to. Because once coherence is fully stabilized, Action doesn't need to be pushed. It emerges naturally, at the right moment, in the right direction, with far less effort than before. And when that happens, the silence you're in now turns into movement, not chaotic movement, but precise momentum that feels inevitable rather than forced. There comes a point where the silence you've been protecting begins to move on its own, not abruptly, not explosively. It starts as a subtle shift in timing. Things line up with less resistance. Conversations happen at the right moment. Decisions no longer feel delayed or rushed. They feel timed. This is when people say manifestation suddenly worked, even though the work was completed long before anything visible appeared. What's important to understand is that momentum doesn't arrive as chaos. It arrives as precision. Opportunities don't overwhelm you. They fit. The external world doesn't force change. It responds to it. And because the internal signal has already stabilized, the movement feels natural instead of dramatic. There's no internal debate about whether to say yes or no. The body already knows. Scientifically, this is what happens when prediction and perception finally align. The brain stops wasting energy trying to control outcomes and begins recognizing patterns instead. Cognitive friction drops. Attention sharpens. You start noticing openings that would have gone unseen before, not because they didn't exist, but because your system wasn't organized to register them. Spiritually, this is the moment where the observer effect becomes lived experience. The way you show up calmer, clearer, less reactive, changes how situations unfold around you. People respond differently. Circumstances rearrange without explanation. It can feel surreal, not because it's magical, but because it's coherent. Nothing is fighting anything else anymore. This is also where time begins to feel compressed. What once seemed far away starts unfolding quickly, not because you accelerated it, but because resistance was removed. When nothing inside you is delaying the process, the field doesn't hesitate. Momentum builds quietly, stacking one aligned moment on top of another. Many people get tempted to announce this phase, to explain it, to label it as success. But the most stable shifts continue to move quietly even here. There's an instinct to protect what's unfolding rather than expose it prematurely. Not from fear, from intelligence. The system knows that coherence deepens when it's lived, not narrated. You may notice that you're doing less but receiving more. That effort feels almost unnecessary now. This can feel disorienting if you've been conditioned to associate progress with struggle. But ease isn't a fluke. It's feedback. It means the internal signal and external response are finally synchronized. This is also where people realize that manifestation was never about controlling reality. It was about becoming predictable to yourself. Once your internal state stopped fluctuating, reality had something solid to organize around. The field didn't need instructions. It recognized consistency. What's crucial here is not to mistake momentum for completion. The shift is active, it's unfolding, and while the hardest part is behind you, this phase still benefits from awareness. Momentum is easiest to maintain when it's not interfered with, which brings us to the final and most overlooked part of the process: how to protect the shift once reality has already begun responding. Because the quiet that brought you here still matters even when things start moving. When reality starts responding, the instinct to relax is natural. You feel relief, confirmation, a sense that something finally clicked. But this is also the phase where many people unknowingly loosen their awareness and allow old patterns to drift back in. Not aggressively, subtly. And subtle shifts are exactly what this process is built on. Protecting a quantum shift doesn't mean staying alert or vigilant. It means staying consistent. The internal state that allowed reality to reorganize doesn't need intensity to be maintained. It needs familiarity. When coherence becomes ordinary, the shift stabilizes. When coherence becomes performative, it weakens. This is why silence still matters here. Not the silence of waiting, but the silence of embodiment. You no longer need to explain what's happening. You no longer need to predict where it's going. The more you live the state without narrating it, the more deeply it roots itself into identity. And identity is what determines which realities remain accessible. From a neurological perspective, this is consolidation. New neural patterns require repetition without contradiction. Each time you respond from the new baseline instead of reverting under pressure, the pattern strengthens. Each time you resist the urge to reintroduce urgency, explanation, or self-monitoring, the nervous system learns that this new state is safe to inhabit. Spirit